Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now.
So you are sitting in a boardroom. You've been studying and, speaking English for a decade.
Right, a really long time.
Exactly. You know all the industry jargon. You know the project details inside and out. And for the first 20 minutes of the meeting, you're holding your own perfectly.
You're probably feeling pretty good about it, too.
Oh, absolutely. But then the presentation ends. The slides click off. Two native speakers across the table lean back, and the pace of the conversation suddenly accelerates.
Oh, yeah. The meeting after the meeting.
Yes. They start bantering. Someone drops a sarcastic, heavily reduced comment about the timeline. The whole room bursts into laughter. And you were just sitting there.
Loss.
Complete. You heard every single individual word they said, but you realized with a sinking feeling that you have absolutely no idea what was just agreed upon. Or, why it was even funny. Why does this happen?
It is a uniquely isolating feeling, truly. It's the moment you realize that knowing the vocabulary and mastering the grammar rules is somehow it's not enough to actually participate in the culture of the language.
Which is exactly what we are dissecting today.
Okay.
We are looking directly at you, the listener, who has poured years into mastering English, only to find yourself stranded in the most psychologically grueling phase of the adult language learning journey.
It really is grueling.
We are going to shine a massive spotlight on the invisible plateau. And you can't really blame them, right? Because the transition into this plateau is so disorienting. If you think back to when you first started the A1, A2, B1 days.
The honeymoon phase.
Exactly. The progress was intoxicating. It was an addictive loop. Like, one week you didn't know how to order a coffee. The next week you did.
You had tangible proof of your success.
Yeah, you could literally point to a conversation and say, I couldn't do that a month ago. You were getting these massive daily dopamine hits of visible, concrete progress.
Which, by the way, is a biological necessity.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, your brain requires that immediate feedback loop to justify the massive cognitive calories you are burning. You are constantly translating and memorizing. The visible wins basically subsidize the sheer exhaustion of early language acquisition.
That makes so much sense. But then, you reach B2, and the dopamine tap just shuts off.
It dries up completely.
So if you are stuck here right now, let's do a quick reality check on your daily life. You are highly functional. You can navigate a professional environment. You read the news without needing a dictionary every 5 seconds. You can go out to dinner. You are surviving.
Actually, I'd say more than surviving. From an outsider's perspective, you appear to be thriving.
Sure, functionally. But internally, you know the truth. You know you don't sound native. When that boardroom banter speeds up and people start talking over each other, your processing speed lags just a fraction of a second behind.
Just enough to miss the window to jump in.
Exactly. Or you look at an email you just wrote, and while you know it is grammatically flawless, it just feels clunky. It lacks that effortless, idiomatic density of a native writer.
Right, it feels mechanical.
Yeah. You know the gap exists, but because there isn't a red squiggly line under your mistakes anymore, you just don't know how to fix it.
Because the nature of the missing puzzle piece has fundamentally changed. When you are at A2, what you are missing is categorical.
Like missing a specific grammar rule.
Right. You are missing the past perfect continuous tense. Or you are missing the vocabulary for kitchen appliances. But at B2, you aren't missing a category of flashcards.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if it's not a secret list of advanced grammar rules we need to memorize, let's get incredibly specific.
Yeah.
What is the actual texture of this gap?
The texture is a great word for it.
Right. Because if you look at the official benchmarks, like the Common European Framework of Reference, the CEFR, they are terribly unhelpful for a learner actually in the trenches.
They are essentially written like corporate HR manuals.
They really are.
If you read the CEFR documentation, it defines your current B2 level as the ability to interact with a degree of fluency and spontaneity that makes regular interaction with native speakers quite possible without strain for either party.
I always get stuck on that phrase, without strain.
It's so misleading.
It paints a picture of two people having a perfectly pleasant time, completely ignoring the fact that underneath the surface, the B2 learner is frantically paddling like a duck just to keep the conversation afloat.
It completely misses the internal cognitive load. You are working so hard just to maintain that illusion of no strain.
And then, if you look at how it defines the C1 level, it says you should be able to recognize implicit meaning, express yourself without obvious searching for expressions, and use controlled organizational patterns.
It sounds like a legal document.
Which sounds incredibly impressive on a certificate, sure. But if I am the person who just froze up in that boardroom, being told to recognize implicit meaning is as useful as being told to, I don't know, just be funnier.
Just be taller.
Exactly. It's an abstract outcome, not a mechanism. It doesn't tell you what a B2 speaker literally looks and sounds like compared to a C1 speaker in the wild.
That is the critical failure of relying on those benchmarks. They just don't capture the observable, physical reality of how the brain produces language. To really understand the gap, we have to look at the mechanics of fluency.
And we need to completely demolish the popular myth of what fluency actually is. Because if you ask the average person on the street, they think a fluent speaker is just someone who talks incredibly fast.
Like a machine gun of vocabulary.
Exactly.
Which couldn't be further from the truth. Speed is merely a byproduct. In linguistics, fluency isn't defined by what is there, it is defined by what is missing. Fluency is the absence of visible cognitive processing.
I love that definition. Think about it like typing. If you are at a B2 level of typing, you are pretty fast. You know where the letters are.
Right, you can get an email out quickly.
But your knowledge is still slightly fragmented. You are typing a sentence, and suddenly you need an ampersand or a specific symbol, and you have to break eye contact with the screen, look down at your hands, find the key, and then look back up.
It breaks the rhythm.
The knowledge of the keyboard is in your brain, sure, but the act of retrieving it physically interrupts your flow. Now contrast that with a C1 touch typer.
They never look down.
The touch typer never looks down. Their eyes are locked on the screen. Their brain is focused entirely on the story they want to tell, the emotion they want to convey, and their fingers just autonomously execute the commands.
That is the perfect biological equivalent, because at B2, the speaker's brain is still manually looking for the keys.
Yeah.
When a B2 speaker is in their comfort zone, they might sound quite fluent. But the second you put them under pressure, say a client asks a left field question, or they have to explain a complex emotional nuance, you see the system buckle.
You literally see their eyes drift up to the ceiling as they search their mental filing cabinet.
Precisely. You see the reformulation pauses. They will start a sentence using one grammatical structure, get halfway through, realize they don't have the vocabulary to land the plane using that structure, abandon the sentence entirely, and just start over.
Which takes a massive toll on the conversation.
Oh, and a massive amount of active caloric energy in the prefrontal cortex to assemble those sentences in real time.
I want to highlight something crucial for the listener here, because this is where so much of the frustration comes from. When you pause mid-sentence, when you abandon a thought and start over, that is rarely because you don't actually know the English words.
Almost never. If I gave a B2 learner a piece of paper and unlimited time, they could write out the exact sentence they just failed to speak.
Right.
The linguistic knowledge is sitting right there in their memory banks.
So what we are witnessing isn't a lack of knowledge. It is a production system that hasn't been automatized. Your brain is treating every sentence like a custom-built piece of furniture rather than an assembly line.
And you can hear this in exactly where the learner breathes. A B2 speaker pauses mid-phrase.
Give me an example of that.
So they will say, I need to review the quarterly projections. They pause because they hit a blank spot in their lexical retrieval.
Right, they're searching for the noun.
Exactly. A C1 speaker still pauses. I mean, we all have to breathe and gather our thoughts, but they pause at the structural joints of the sentence. They pause at natural phrase boundaries.
How does that sound different?
They will say, I need to review the quarterly projections because the margins look off. They are retrieving language in massive prefabricated chunks rather than word by agonizing word.
This is a wildly liberating realization. If you are sitting on the B2 plateau, The solution is not to go out and buy another advanced grammar workbook.
Put the workbook down.
Seriously.
Yeah.
You already possess the raw linguistic materials required to sound like a C1 speaker. The gap is entirely about the depth of your automaticity.
It is the shift from declarative knowledge, knowing a fact, to procedural knowledge, which is knowing how to execute a reflex.
But if speaking at a C1 level is about the effortless physical production of language, listening at a C1 level feels like a totally different beast. Because in that boardroom scenario we started with, the failure wasn't about speaking. The failure was about comprehending the invisible.
Yeah, this is where we move past the physics of fluency and enter the psychology of communication. Comprehending at a C1 level is fundamentally about reading between the lines.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this is what the CEFR vaguely calls implicit meaning, which English relies on heavily, especially if you are dealing with British or Australian English, where the entire culture is essentially held together by sarcasm, irony, and devastating understatement.
Oh, absolutely. Let's break down the cognitive gymnastics required to process understatement, because it's fascinating.
Walk us through it.
Imagine you are debriefing with a colleague after a catastrophic pitch to a client. The client yelled, the projector caught fire, it was a total disaster.
A nightmare scenario.
Right. Your colleague leans back and sighs, well, that was not our most successful hour.
To a native speaker, that is hilarious. It relieves the tension in the room. But let's look at what the brain has to do to actually understand that.
It's a lot. Your brain has to instantly process the literal dictionary definition of the words. Then it has to process the objective reality of what just happened in the room, realize there is a massive intentional discrepancy between the two, and then interpret that discrepancy as humor rather than delusion.
And you have to do all of that in a fraction of a second, based on nothing but context, and maybe a slight drop in the pitch of their voice.
A tiny shift in intonation.
Yeah. If your brain is still manually translating the word successful from English to your native language, the moment is gone. You are 5 seconds behind the joke.
Let's look at a more subtle example, something linguists call conversational implicature.
Ooh, fancy term.
It's just the logical math of native speech. Imagine we are at the office and I ask you, are you coming to the company dinner tonight? And you reply, I have an early flight tomorrow.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second. If I'm a learner, I might look at that exchange and say, well, isn't having an early flight just an idiom for saying no? Don't I just need to memorize a list of phrases like that?
What's fascinating here is that it is absolutely not an idiom. An idiom is a fixed phrase like kick the bucket.
Right.
Saying I have an early flight is a literal factual statement about your itinerary. The magic happens in the implied logic.
Right, because if a strictly D2 listener hears that, they process the literal data. They think, okay, he is flying somewhere tomorrow morning. But wait, he didn't answer my question. I asked a yes or no question about the dinner, and he gave me his travel schedule. Are you coming or not?
Exactly. The B2 brain is waiting for the explicit structural answer. But a C1 listener processes the invisible math instantly. The brain fires off a syllogism like, he has an early flight. Flights require sleep. Company dinners go late. Staying out late threatens sleep. Therefore, his priority is sleep. Therefore, this statement is a polite, face-saving refusal.
And all of that deduction happens in milliseconds.
In the blink of an eye.
It's invisible math. And this is exactly why fast, casual English feels impossible to penetrate. It is not just the physical speed of the syllables hitting your eardrum. It is the velocity of the implied logic.
Native speakers are constantly tossing these logical puzzles back and forth.
And layering them with cultural references, historical allusions, and pop culture.
They are speaking in shorthand. If a native speaker says a project is a catch-22, they aren't just using a fun vocabulary word. They are downloading the entire thematic concept of Joseph Heller's novel into the conversation to describe an inescapable paradox.
And if you don't have that cultural database, you don't just miss a word. You miss the entire structural foundation of the argument.
Which raises the ultimate problem. You cannot take a multiple-choice test on how to understand irony.
You cannot memorize a flashcard for conversational math.
Which is exactly why formal, classroom-based instruction completely falls apart at this stage. You cannot explicitly teach implicit meaning.
So how do you learn it?
The only way the brain learns to detect these subtle departures from the literal truth is by first building a massive neurological baseline of what normal sounds like.
You have to know what the background noise sounds like so you can hear the silence.
Exactly that. You build that baseline through massive, extensive exposure to authentic input. Thousands upon thousands of hours of native speakers talking to other native speakers.
But this invisible layer of language doesn't just affect how you listen, though. It directly dictates how you speak and how you write. The ability to detect subtle, unspoken meaning is the exact same muscle you use to select your own words.
It's a two-way street.
And this is where we see that the vocabulary upgrade from B2 to C1 is not about learning more words. It's about understanding the specific gravity of the words you already know.
This is a huge distinction because both a B2 learner and a C1 learner have vast vocabularies. The quantitative difference is actually negligible, but the C1 learner possesses a qualitative depth that we can break down into three distinct areas of mastery:
Let's hear them.
synonymic range, collocation depth, and connotative awareness.
Okay, let's unpack the first one, synonymic range. It's a realization that just because a thesaurus groups two words together, it doesn't mean they are interchangeable.
Right, they aren't clones of each other.
Let's take the words sad and melancholy. A B2 speaker knows both words, but when they're speaking, they just reach into the bucket and grab whichever one their hand touches first.
Because they view them as functional equivalents. But a C1 speaker knows that melancholy carries a very specific atmospheric weight. It implies a gentle, reflective, almost aesthetic sadness.
Yeah, you might feel melancholy while listening to jazz on a rainy afternoon, but you would never say, I feel melancholy because I just dropped my phone in a puddle.
If you use melancholy for dropping your phone, you sound incredibly dramatic. A native speaker might think you are making a joke.
And if you aren't making a joke, you just sound subtly bizarre. The C1 speaker deploys these words like a scalpel. They use angry when someone steals their cab, but they use indignant when their fundamental sense of justice has been violated.
Which leads directly into the second area, collocation depth. Collocations are simply the invisible magnetic pull between certain words. Why do certain words always travel in pairs?
Like why we say heavy rain instead of strong rain, even though both technically convey the exact same physical reality.
Exactly. A B2 speaker is generally fine with those high-frequency collocations. They've heard heavy rain enough times to adopt it. The problem arises when the B2 speaker tries to sound more advanced.
Oh, this happens all the time.
They take a rare, sophisticated word and they pair it with a basic verb, creating a highly unusual combination. They might say, he did a terrible crime instead of he committed a crime. Or they might say, I strongly regret instead of I deeply regret.
It's like wearing a tuxedo jacket with sweatpants. Both items are clothing, but the combination is jarring. A C1 speaker's collocational knowledge runs incredibly deep. They intuitively know which adjectives belong to which nouns, even with highly specialized vocabulary.
Yes, the pairings just feel right to them.
But I think the third area is the most dangerous one, because if you get it wrong, you don't just sound awkward. You can actively offend people.
Connotative awareness. This is the mastery of a word's emotional, social, and political baggage beyond its literal dictionary definition.
Let's look at the words economical and cheap. They both describe a situation where little money is spent. If you translate them into another language, they might even map onto the exact same word.
But in the cultural ecosystem of English, economical is a virtue. It implies intelligence, efficiency, and resourcefulness. Cheap, on the other hand, is a character flaw.
It's totally pejorative.
It implies a lack of generosity or a willingness to accept poor quality just to save a dollar.
If I tell a client, I love this proposal, it's incredibly economical, they're thrilled. If I say, I love this proposal, it's incredibly cheap, the entire energy of the room instantly sours. I have just insulted their work.
And a C1 speaker navigates that minefield instinctively. A B2 speaker will frequently swap those words by accident, completely unaware of the emotional shrapnel they're leaving behind in the conversation.
And the fascinating part is that the native speaker on the receiving end often can't even articulate why they are suddenly irritated. They just know that the vibe of the conversation has shifted. The connotative clash has done its damage silently.
It's completely subliminal.
Now, it can be really hard to self-diagnose these issues in real time while you are speaking. But if you want to put your language skills under a microscope, there is one diagnostic tool that strips away all the variables. Look at your writing.
Writing is the ultimate litmus test. When you speak, you can mask a lot of B2 deficiencies with charisma, hand gestures, facial expressions, or simply the momentum of the conversation.
You can charm your way out of it.
But on paper, your structural choices are frozen in time. There is nowhere to hide.
Let's do a live breakdown of this. If I read a typical paragraph written by a B2 professional, it sounds something like this. The project experienced several delays. First, the supplier did not deliver the materials on time. Next, the budget was reduced by the finance department. Therefore, we could not meet the original deadline. However, we are confident in the new schedule.
Okay, so there is not a single grammatical error in that paragraph, but it is instantly recognizable as B2 writing because it relies entirely on what we call sentence aggregation.
It feels mechanical. It feels like a robot stacking Lego bricks on top of each other.
It is entirely syntactically simple. The writer is relying on heavy-handed basic transitions. First, next, therefore, however. The sentences do not talk to each other, they just sit next to each other.
So how do we rewrite that? How do we build that C1 textual flow?
A C1 writer uses complex cohesive devices, things like substitution, ellipsis, and lexical cohesion, to weave the sentences into a single fabric.
Give us the C1 version.
A C1 version of that exact same information might read like this. Meeting the original deadline became impossible following a series of setbacks, notably a failure in the supply chain compounded by sudden budget cuts. We remain confident, however, that the revised schedule is robust.
Wow. The difference is night and day. The C1 version uses complex syntax not to show off, but because it is the most efficient way to package the relationships between the ideas. It uses the word compounded to show how the budget cuts interacted with the supply chain failure.
And notice the register, the level of formality. It is flawlessly consistent. A common B2 mistake is a wobbling register. They might use a highly academic phrase in one sentence and then use casual slang in the next, because they aren't fully tuned to the connotative weight of their vocabulary.
So, listener, if you want to know exactly where you stand, look at the last important email or report you wrote in English. What were you doing when you revised it? Were you scanning the text looking for mistakes? Checking to make sure you didn't mess up a preposition or a verb tense?
If your primary revision strategy is error correction, you are operating in a B2 mindset. You are still focused on the mechanics of accuracy.
But if you look at your writing and you already know the grammar is bulletproof, and instead you are agonizing over precision, if you spend 5 minutes debating whether to use the word suggest or imply because you know it changes the power dynamic of the email,
That's the shift.
or if you are rewriting a sentence purely because the rhythm of the syllables feels slightly off, that is C1 behavior. That calibration of tone and register is the defining mark of an advanced user.
It's the difference between a mechanic checking to see if the engine turns on and an engineer tuning the engine to shave 1/10 of a second off a lap time.
All right, we've thoroughly diagnosed the disease. We know exactly what the B2 plateau looks like, sounds like, and feels like. The million-dollar question now is the cure. How do you actually rewire your brain to cross this gap? And realistically, how much of your life is this going to consume?
Well, the timeline is the bitter pill that every learner has to swallow. Research on the correlation between formal instruction and CEFR progression indicates that moving from a solid B2 to a secure C1 requires roughly 200 to 400 additional hours of focused practice.
Okay, I need to stop you there because 400 hours is a staggering number.
Yeah.
If I study for an hour a day, every single day, no weekends off, no vacations, that is well over a year. That's a part-time job. Are you telling the listener they have to go back to school for a year?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you'll see why that's not true. That 400-hour metric is drawn almost entirely from studies of instructed learning. It measures how long it takes a student sitting at a desk in a classroom, filling out worksheets, and listening to a teacher explain grammar to pass a C1 exam.
Okay, so it's measuring a highly inefficient method of learning.
Exactly. It completely underestimates the sheer biological efficiency of creating an immersive, authentic environment. When you take the language out of the textbook and force your brain to use it as a survival tool in the real world, the neuroplasticity accelerates dramatically.
This is the dividing line. Let's clearly define the habits of the learners who get stuck on the plateau forever versus the ones who actually break through.
Great idea.
Because the stuck learners rely heavily on monitored practice. They write things down before they say them. They only consume English through the lens of language learning apps. And fundamentally, they have allowed their brain's survival mechanism to turn off because their B2 English is, quote-unquote, good enough to order a coffee and answer an email.
Right, and the brain is relentlessly efficient. If it doesn't need to adapt to survive, it simply won't expend the calories to do so. The learners who reach C1 force their brains into a constant state of adaptation. They consume massive amounts of authentic media, and they force themselves to produce language without a safety net.
So what are the specific actionable practices that force this adaptation? We're going to give you 3 distinct tactics today. And spoiler alert, none of them involve flashcards.
Throw the flashcards away.
Practice number 1, extended long-form reading.
Notice the emphasis on extended. We are not talking about scrolling through social media or reading a 2-paragraph news brief. We are talking about committing to novels, deeply researched nonfiction, long-form journalism, or academic texts.
Now, why reading? We just spent 20 minutes talking about how hard, fast, spoken English is to understand. Shouldn't I just be listening to fast English?
Well, listening is vital, obviously, but spoken English is ephemeral. It vanishes the second the sound wave dissipates. If you don't instantly understand the subtle distinction between economical and cheap in a fast conversation, the speaker moves on, and your brain misses the opportunity to analyze the data. Reading provides the one variable your brain desperately needs to acquire high-level nuance: pace control.
Pace control. You control the flow of time.
Exactly.
When you are reading a novel and you encounter a complex C1 level syntactic structure, you can physically stop your eyes from moving down the page. You can look at how the author used a semicolon. You can analyze the cohesive devices we talked about earlier. Reading builds your internal database of collocations and connotative weight far more efficiently than auditory input, because it gives your visual cortex the time to process the texture of the language.
It trains your brain to recognize the architectural blueprints of advanced English. Once you can recognize the blueprint on paper, it becomes exponentially easier to recognize it when someone speaks it aloud at 100 words a minute.
Okay, practice number 2. Unmonitored spoken production in authentic contexts.
This one is tough.
It is. This means having real, unscripted conversations where there are actual stakes. Negotiating a price, debating a political topic with a friend, or explaining a complex problem. This does not mean sitting in a language class taking turns answering a prompt from a teacher.
The key word there is unmonitored. You have to place yourself in environments where the social pressure of the conversation forces you to prioritize immediate communication over grammatical perfection. You cannot afford the luxury of mentally drafting your sentence before you speak.
And I want to speak directly to the emotional reality of this because it is going to feel terrible. When you do this, you are going to feel a spike of anxiety. You are going to feel your brain scrambling for words. You are going to make mistakes you thought you outgrew at the B1 level, and you are going to have that sinking, cringe-inducing feeling of, man, I sound stupid right now.
But you have to reframe how you view that discomfort, that anxiety, that biological spike in cortisol. That is not a sign that you are failing. That stress response is the literal biological forge of memory formation.
That is profound. The cringe is the mechanism of progress.
Precisely. When you force your brain to retrieve a word under the pressure of real-time communication, and you struggle, and you finally find it, that struggle heavily myelinates the neural pathway. It turns a dirt road in your brain into a superhighway. The discomfort is your brain taking the B2 knowledge it holds passively and painfully converting it into the automatic C1 access we discussed earlier.
And if you only practice speaking when you are perfectly comfortable and prepared,
you are just reinforcing the dirt road.
Wow. So embrace the unmonitored cringe. Put yourself in situations where you have to speak before you are ready. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. Practice number 3. Extensive listening at the edge of productive discomfort.
We established that reading builds the structural database, but you still have to tune your ear to the frequency of implicit meaning, irony, and sarcasm. The type of listening you choose is critical. It has to exist in a very specific psychological zone.
It's the Goldilocks principle, right?
Yeah.
If you listen to a podcast for English learners that is spoken slowly and clearly, you understand 100% of it. Your brain says, great, I know all this, and it shuts off its neuroplastic adaptation mode. It just relaxes.
Conversely, if you turn on a highly technical, fast-paced debate on theoretical physics, and you only understand 20% of the vocabulary, your brain gets overwhelmed, determines the input is just meaningless noise, and shuts down to protect itself from frustration.
So you need to find audio, documentaries, native-level podcasts, talk shows, where you effortlessly understand about 85 to 90% of what is being said. You can follow the narrative perfectly, but that remaining 10 to 15%, that's where the magic happens.
That's the sweet spot.
That's the slang, the cultural allusions, the rapid-fire jokes that make you strain just a little bit.
That 15% deficit keeps your brain in a state of active hunting. It keeps the cognitive engine running hot. You are using the 85% of context you understand to actively decipher the 15% you don't. That is productive discomfort, and it is the fastest way to download the cultural software of the language.
So what does this all mean? If we pull all the way back, what is the grand unified theory here? Reaching C1, finally escaping that agonizing B2 boardroom scenario, is not an academic exercise. You cannot study your way out of the plateau.
No, it requires a fundamental behavioral shift in how you interact with the language. It requires abandoning the safety of textbooks and embracing the messy, uncurated chaos of native media.
It's about consuming long-form, high-definition reading to map the territory. It's about voluntarily subjecting yourself to the psychological discomfort of unmonitored speaking, knowing that every time you stumble, you are physically rewiring your brain for automaticity. And it is about relentlessly tuning your ear to the unspoken implications, the sarcasm and the cultural echoes, until processing that invisible layer of English is as automatic as breathing.
The tools are simple, but the execution requires a tolerance for feeling slightly out of your depth day after day.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply provocative question for you to mull over. We've established that truly mastering C1 means mastering the implicit meaning of the language. It means adopting the cultural database, the specific brand of irony, and the connotative weight of an entirely different society.
You are essentially installing a new set of contextual expectations into your brain.
Exactly. So at what point does mastering this invisible layer of English begin to subtly rewire your actual personality?
Oh, that's a wild thought.
Right. If you train your brain to instinctively navigate the world using the sharp directness of American corporate culture, or the hyperpolite understatement of British social dynamics, does it bleed over? When you finally shatter that B2 wall and you step fully into the effortless flow of C1, and then you go home and switch back to your native language at the end of the day, are you still exactly the same person? Or has mastering the soul of a new language built an entirely new room inside your mind? Think about it the next time you hesitate over a word. Until next time, keep embracing the discomfort.